Well, some parts are back from the cleaner, so I will just start reassembling things as I go. I'm just working on the body at the moment. I will do the rangefinder and shutter separately and then mate everything up. Checking that's running nice and freely. That's a shutter release mechanism there. And that chrome finger presses on the arm on the shutter itself, and the chrome finger is in turn pressed down with another lever. It's spring tucked in correctly. It's nice and free in its action. I don't think that requires anything in that case. And these two components need to go together. So in order to put that into the shroud, you'll need the buttons and the springs for the buttons. It's a bit of a mixture, this camera. Some parts had been greased very heavily, and other parts had received no grease at all, or virtually no grease at all. It's quite a mixture. So I'll just wipe some synthetic grease in here, and I'm being pretty sparing with this, just to make sure those surfaces aren't dry where the buttons are to run. And the springs go into the holes in the buttons, the hollows. They do not go over the post on the buttons. Where are we? Still on camera? We are only just. Alright, put these in position. The buttons are identical. They've got a flat on one side, they only go, well, they've got the pin that lines them up, so they can only go in one position. That's that. So holding those squeezed firmly together, I can slide on the shroud. And they just pop into position. You hear those buttons pop up and lock the front standard in the forward position. Now I'll apply some synthetic lubricant to the guide rails top and bottom here that the front standard runs on. And the top and bottom surface where the buttons actually run back into the body. It's often easier to get at that from the front side, up in here. That button has to run over that surface, and even though it's a shiny button, it does have some friction there. So that's that little bit done. Well, this little bracket here for the shutter release can drop in place there. That just fits in there, and I'll just slide the front standard back into the shroud to hold it in place so it can't drop out, because otherwise this piece is very prone to falling out and causing you lots of grief. We can pop that to one side now. Now this is the shutter cocking rack that came out of this camera. And you may or may not notice that the tab on the end here is quite rectangular. That's like the shutter cocking racks were early in the manufacture. They were all like that. With the Retina IIIC, they had a bevel on them. I don't know if you can see it, there's a bevel right on this face here where that has been beveled away, just shaved off at an angle, and that is so it clears this back face of the rangefinder. It allows the rack to slide back just that little bit extra. The rack in this camera is entirely rectangular across the back there. So that suggests that that part was a spare part, and possibly even an old spare part, or possibly a remanufactured spare part, but was not ideal for a Retina IIIC camera. Well, the transfer shaft has to go back into the camera body. So I'm just applying a bit of synthetic grease to that. Front and rear surfaces, because the bracket that holds it into the body obviously will be providing some friction otherwise. That just sits in there, and a small screw goes in from the top. Just some threads of adhesive there, we'll get rid of those while I'm here. Small round-headed screw goes in there. Now the hole in the body is slightly oversized, which means that the screw slops around in it, which means that you can adjust the position of that bracket forward slightly, which is important because you want it snug, supporting the rack to stop the rack from floating. Otherwise the rack may slide. If that shaft is allowed to float, basically you could end up in a situation where only half the width of the rack and the gear are engaged. Well, obviously it would wear out quite quickly. You want the whole width of the rack and the gear pretty much engaged with each other. And I find about a 4/1000th of an inch, which is 0.1 millimetre, serves as a very good space to allow there, so that it runs smoothly without a great deal of unwanted friction. That feels good. I'll just check that that bracket is sitting straight forward and aft, because it's only got one screw holding it. It can wobble about a bit otherwise. But no, that looks good. So that's in place. We've got our shroud assembly and lens standard here. They can be slid into place. Let's get that shaft up through that hole. Fits back into the body. That went back pretty smoothly. And there are 4 screws. Now this video camera just gave me a memory card error at that point, so I don't know whether it recorded or saved any of that last bit. Basically I was saying that the screws need to be done up good and tight, that they go into bushes that are pressed into the housing from the inside. If you press on the screws too hard when you're trying to get them started, you'll pop those bushes out, and then you've got to go all the trouble of putting them back in place. However, that's not our problem today. Everything's going smoothly. At the bottom of the camera, well, we'll put our little black spacer in there, that little dress piece, even though it's a crap thing to do, because that's how the camera was built. And this needs to be historically accurate. Otherwise people will think that it's not an authentic Retina IIIC type 028/N. They'll think it's some bodgy thing that some naughty person has put together to deceive people. However, I believe this is authentic. It's authentic in a crappy way, because that's how they made it. So that's that little piece back in. So our tripod socket's in, and the advantage of that when you're working on the camera is when you put this down on the bench, you're not banging it on the back catch release and having the back swing open on you and annoying you no end. So there's our camera body with that all in place, and really what I want to do now is sort out the focus mount. So I'll get on to that. I've got my components. There's the mount, the inner and outer helical, and the retaining ring for the same. These have all been cleaned in solvent, in the ultrasonic cleaner and then through with domestic detergent, in this case Handy Andy, which is one of those white ammonia based cleaners. Nothing fantastic, the sort of thing you'd use on your floors or your walls or something of that nature, but it's pretty good at cutting grease and it gets rid of the residual rubbish after this has been through the degreaser. Leaves my parts nice and clean. And what I'm doing here is getting the inner and outer helical correctly timed. Multi-start thread, and they need to be in the correct position so that everything goes back where it came from. And there, that's it done there. So I've got my alignment marks here, double lines there and single line there. They align when the inner and outer helical are level with each other, so I know that's exactly the right position. That's good. And here's my focus mount, and that's all clean. That's ready to go back in the body. Alright, get this focus mount back in here, I suppose. It's held in place with 4 screws. Bring that forward to the extended position for convenience. It's worth taking a bit of extra care when you're putting screws in a position like this, to avoid slipping off with your screwdriver and potentially scarring that inner surface where the focus helicals have to run. And it's much better if that remains nice and smooth. So that's in place, and we've got the focus helicals inner and outer here, and they're clean, are correctly adjusted, need some helical grease. So I'll keep that just engaged and no more. Normally I put a little patch of grease around here in about 5 or 6 different places. Now I could see a little hair or something in the grease at that point, so I hope that's not going to go in there and cause me grief. Just checking that action is smooth. Feels very good. Run some around the outside surface. And just a touch in the 2 little slots there where it runs on the guide rails here. And this went up that way with the single scribe line to the top and the double scribe line to the bottom, because that's the way I normally do it. Everybody has their own convention for marking, and that's fine. All you need is a system that you understand, and if you do it consistently, then you don't have to think very hard about remembering how things will go. If you do it inconsistently, then you're forever trying to remember how you did it this time. check that's moving smoothly. I think I'll put a little bit of grease under that, because I haven't greased put any lubricant under the edge of this retaining ring, and it could certainly benefit from it, so we'll do that. And of course we can use the same helical grease. That's better. Get those screws up tight. Check that the outer helical moves smoothly. It does. Collapse the front, and there are 4 screws that hold the bellows to the back of the front standard. They're these long black screws. They need to go in place. Let's extend the front. And the focus scale ring can go on there. But I see I haven't wiped that yet, so let's give that a quick wipe. And of course we have our alignment marks that I'd put on there. Now I'll get this 4 screws in, don't tighten them up, just get them in place. And then you can make any final adjustment you need to in order to get your alignment marks correctly aligned to your satisfaction. That's why it's useful to have a set at the top and the bottoms, because you can average out the position of them so that you're happy that you've got it correct. That's fine. Now I need the coupling arm that couples our rangefinder. This has been through the degreaser, it's been degreased, it's been washed out, it's got absolutely no lubricant here at all. And unfortunately its pivot point here is riveted. And it'll be dry and it's rough. And it does not move smoothly. So a little drop of oil on there and work that in. Makes that hinge point work nice and smooth, which is exactly what you need. If you don't do that, only if you've cleaned it as thoroughly as I have, of course. I've cleaned out any residual oil and create my own bloody problems. If you do that, you're going to need to put some lubricant back into that joint, otherwise it will not run smoothly. It'll be stiff, and it means that the action of the focusing may be stiff and the action of the rangefinder may be slightly jerky. So we've got 2 screws hold this plate to the front of the inner helical, and at the back is a single screw which couples to the rangefinder. And on this camera it is black. We'll see if I can get that arm across a bit. Where's it gone? Oh, now I've lost the arm there, so I'm going to have to see if I can find out where it's gone to. Oh, there it is. It slid all the way across. That's better. There it is. Get that single screw in. Make sure that screw is centered in the slot. If you do it up to one side, it'll actually bind up that action and it won't move correctly. You'd discover it pretty quick, and the focus would be very, very stiff and things would get bent. I'll just put a touch of grease in there, and as I move the focus scale ring, you'll see that pin move in and out. And as the front of the camera is collapsed, that pin actually runs away down a track out of the way, which allows the front of the camera to collapse. If it was rigid, it would have to stick out the back of the camera, and clearly it does not. So what have we got? We've got the coupling here for that transfer shaft that transfers the action from the shutter cocking rack to the shutter. That sits there. Put a smear of grease on that front face, and doesn't need any more than that. And the bush is where it's probably right in front of me and I can't see it. There it is. And the two screws, which are chrome plated and very easily damaged here and here. Put that in position. And these two screws, if you've made a mess of one, which is not an uncommon thing to happen because they are small and easily damaged, put the ugly one down the bottom here where no one can see it. Have the pretty one at the top here where people can see it. And that way no one will know that you've made a mess of one. Or you might be compensating for somebody else's clumsy work, in which case you're doing exactly the same. Alright, so that's that. So that all opens and shuts nicely. We'll just close that down in there, otherwise this piece here in the shutter release mechanism can fall into the bellows at the back and cause lots of weeping and gnashing of teeth. We don't want to do that. Right, so that part's good, and I think that really we can be putting in the lock lever and release lever, which are here and here. Now the lock lever, there's nothing controversial about that. That's like the lock lever in Retina cameras from here to Christmas. This release lever, I'll zoom in a little bit. Now you'll see that this tip here has got a little notch in it. That was a feature on later models. Certainly the Reflex 4, possibly some other model that I don't really deal with very often. I don't recall it being ever being used on a Retina IIIC. Although I have to say I'm not the last of the 3Cs to be manufactured may have used something like that, but I suspect that this feature is different, that it's something that came from a later model, and it's certainly not what I would expect to find in a Retina 3C camera. It'll certainly do the job. It's got enough in common that it'll do the job quite well, but it's just not identical. Now, where's my spring? The spring that was on this. It's definitely like the springs from one of the reflex models. It's got an extra uptick on it here. I don't remember whether the later 3Cs had that little uptick on it. I suspect they didn't. It doesn't really matter, you can use this spring on the earlier models quite well. And what did I do? It's about hit it off into the bushes then. But certainly this arm, that's a little bit odd looking. That post, that little rivet post there, is normally the whole thing is nickel plated. It's all one colour. Here we've got a nickel plated shaft. There's grey finished steel here for the arm and the end, and a very coppery looking brass rivet there. So it's definitely not quite identical to what I'm used to seeing on a Retina 3 Big C or Small C or any of that family. So I'm gathering up its spring for the, we'll start with the lock lever, and I've got its spring, which is the smaller of the two springs of that style. Now we come to another difference. All of the Retinas use a little C-clip or E-clip to hold this together, and universally it's black finish. This is shiny finish. It's a shiny, probably nickel plated finish. So that is most definitely a difference. It's a minor and inconsequential difference perhaps, but it certainly shows that it is not one of the original parts that would have been used on the production line Retina 3C cameras.